Come on. We were doing so well.
I'm sorry, I had to inhale.
Welcome to our Professor podcast. I'm Micah Sander,
I'm Carter Green.
and today we spoke with Professor Steven Remy.
Actually, one sec. I need to go for 2 seconds. I'm sorry.
Okay, don't do it. Do it.
We've done so many interviews. We're still dealing with this.
It's Mother's Day today.
Which is why we spoke to Steven Remy.
I was gonna say if you choose, call your mother, tell her nice things, maybe include an emoji or an exclamation point in the text. His audio was sounding a little bright. I hope he fixes it.
No, it's okay. I have a water bottle now. It's deflect the light. That's how light works.
Perfect. You can put some in the bottle. Okay. Where was I? Okay.
We spoke to Professor.
We spoke with Professor Steven Remy. Professor Steven Remy has taught modern European history at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center since 2002. He earned his BA from Miami University and his MA and PhD from Ohio University. He teaches courses in modern European and German history, Nazi Germany, the politics and culture of memory in 20th century Europe, colonial wars, and historical methodology. He is the author of The Heidelberg Myth, the Nazification and Denazification of a German University, the Malmedy Massacre, the War Crimes Trial Controversy, Adolf Hitler, a reference guide to his life and works, and War Crimes, Law, Politics, and Armed Conflict in the Modern World, coming soon. He is also currently appearing as a commentator in the National Geographic documentary series Hitler, The Lost Tapes of the Third Reich, streaming on National Geographic and also on Hulu. Someone who has taken a class with Professor Remy is our friend Joseph. Joseph, welcome to our Professor podcast.
Welcome.
Hello.
Joseph, can you tell us a little bit about what it's like to take a class with Professor Remy?
The class that I'm taking, which is What is Fascism, is a bit different than a lot of his other classes. So in his class, a lot of it is we'll deal with a lot of readings and then come to class instead of lecture based. There are some bits and pieces of lectures, but it's more discussion based. It's more important that you do the majority of the reading at home so that you can actually come better informed to have a discussion. And I think the class is liveliest when everyone does the reading and is actually able to respond. But in general, no, it's really nice. It's sort of like Professor Remy kind of treats us like we're discussion equals, in the sense that the important part of the class is not exactly the theory, or exactly the theory is important and a lot of it deals with the theory of fascism, but it's more important the actual applications. And since we're also living observers, our observations and our thoughts are just as important. I mean, clearly we base ourselves off of documents and stuff, but I just think it's less dry. It's less of oh, these are the facts and you must memorize them, and more, here's what's happened, how do you approach those. And I think that that's why the only assignments really in class are a set of podcasts that you have to make in groups. And I think the reason that Professor Remy, and I can't speak for him as to why, if this is really the reason he chose this, and invite me, my English major, leaking into the fact that I need to read some sort of symbolism into everything. But the podcasts are all about student groups interpreting documents and events around them to add to class. And I think part of the reason the class uses podcasts is just the fact that what the point of the class is to make people think and to make people actually have to implement their own views, I guess, on the topic, and also grapple with the world, because democracy is not really healthy right now. So maybe it's sort of the fact that this is very important. The big lessons of the class is that you kind of need to talk about fascism to stop fascism. So it kind of forces us to look outside into the world and not just the random old book from 70 years ago that talks specifically about Italy or Germany, because it's still very relevant. And the way it maintains its relevancy is by letting it grow beyond just those texts.
Big J, J Dog, JoJo, my main man from the J Street. I'd like if you could speak a little bit on Remy as not only a person but as a professor.
Okay, well, I told Micah I was going to say this during the podcast. So, Professor Remy has a very bad opinion about Hitler and the Nazis.
Go on.
This is a hot scoop.
What is the?
He doesn't like them.
Oh, so he doesn't.
He has a very
like,
negative opinion about them. Bad opinion, not in the sense that like the opinion is bad, but that his opinion of them is bad.
This is going to be the heaviest edited intro we've ever.
Okay, so I mean, I think especially like in discussions in class, he just seems very interested a lot. We talk about, especially like the day-to-day things. He's let discussions kind of completely go off the rails about like Andrew Tate and all these other horrible fascist stuff. And he seems very interested in learning what students think and how they interact. He's kind of always in his office, so that's really nice and helpful. Yeah, he likes talking with students. I have been bothering him a lot, but so I've been abusing the office hours a lot because I was working on another project with him. And so I would kind of come at least once a week, and he'd always be happy to speak with me and just talk and discuss and give advice. I will say, it might just be me. I'm intimidated to talk to professors all the time. Micah knows this. I have a problem where I just don't go to people's offices because sometimes their doors are closed, and I don't know what I'm supposed to think about that. But luckily, Professor Remy keeps his office door open, so I could actually just see if he was busy or not. So that's very helpful. But yeah, I mean, there's nothing really like important about that, but I don't know. I don't feel bad about bothering him in his office anymore. So I think that's a good thing, I guess, if you take that from someone who is generally terrified about going to professors' offices.
I hope that, Joseph, your testimony in this interview will just get more students talking. Thank you so much. Let's get right to it. Everybody, please give a warm welcome to Professor Steven Remy. Thank you, Professor Remy, for being on our Professor podcast. The first question that we have for you today is, why did you choose your area of study? Did it change over time? And was there a particularly important professor or mentor at any stage of your education?
Yeah, thanks, Micah and Carter. Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. I have had a long-standing interest in modern European history and in modern Germany's history, and I'll put Austria in that category too. I do have some family background. My maternal grandparents were immigrants from Austria after World War I. I've been back years ago, visited the towns that they came from. But that wasn't it mainly. It was part of it, the family background. But like I think a lot of boys, younger men, I had an interest going back to probably middle school in the Second World War. And this is the late 1970s, 1980s. That played a role in it too. And I had a very inspiring high school teacher, and over the years teaching at Brooklyn College, I've learned that this was a major reason why a lot of undergraduates go on, and MA students in education go on to be history majors and be social studies and history teachers, because they had a very inspiring teacher. And I'm still in contact with them. When I publish a book, I send them a copy. That's a very good feeling. When I got my undergraduate degree and returned from the Peace Corps, I moved to Washington, D.C. I worked briefly on Capitol Hill for a member of the House of Representatives, and then worked briefly for a think tank, the Atlantic Council of the United States, which at that time was a kind of unofficial representative of NATO in the United States. You had a lot of retired diplomats and professional military who had retired, but they wanted to stay involved in the policy world, and think tanks in Washington are a good place to do that. And this was the early 1990s. The Cold War had just ended. Germany had been reunified, and I got really, really interested in the Cold War, and met, in my capacity working at the Atlantic Council, I met a lot of people who had been in on the ground floor at the beginning of the Cold War, and of course had lived to see the entire thing. That was quite an experience. That got me interested in diplomatic history, and I decided that I wanted to pursue a PhD and applied to the Contemporary History Institute at Ohio University. And that's where John Lewis Gaddis taught, and he supervised my MA. But finally, this gets to another part of your question. My interests were turning more from American diplomatic history to the history of modern Germany. And I got really lucky because that's when the scholar who would become my mentor, Jeffrey Herf, who would go on to a very distinguished career at the University of Maryland, joined the faculty at Ohio University. And so did Norman Goda, who is now at the University of Florida. So I was actually doubly lucky. Jeff Herf supervised my dissertation. We're still close. Just a week ago, I participated in a conference in his honor at the University of Maryland. He's retiring. He's now Professor Emeritus. Jeff is one of the most influential historians of modern Germany of his generation. And I was his first doctoral student. So I was lucky there, too, to have such an important advisor, mentor, when I trained to be an academic historian.
I actually have a copy of The United States and the Origins of the Cold War, John Lewis Gaddis here. I'm not sure if this is your copy or Napoli's or Johnson's. I found it in the lounge.
Yeah, that was John's it was his first book, I'm pretty sure, based on his dissertation, and one that really changed the terms of the debate about the origins of the Cold War for diplomatic historians.
It must be difficult to talk about modern German history without the big looming Nazi Germany that takes the forefront of a lot of conversation. I mean, it gets a lot of attention naturally. Now, I'm not saying that it should be ignored. It's very important. But are there parts of your field that you feel are overshadowed by Nazi Germany? And additionally, what are some misconceptions about German history that you run into?
Yeah, those are good questions, Carter. I think that as to the first question, for understandable and necessary reasons, the experience of National Socialism, its origins, its coming to power, its rule over Germany, the war, and its aftermath and memory are enormously important events for Germany, for Europe, for the world. And I don't think this is really the case anymore. But for a long time, it was just, it drew so much energy and attention, and you had to be careful. I think, for example, in looking at Germany in the late 19th century or the early 20th century, including up through the Weimar period, there was a temptation, I think, for a long time. It's not the case anymore, but for a long time to see those periods or treat them as precursors to the Nazi period, which had the tendency, among other things, of making the Nazi period, the rise of Hitler and the Nazis coming to power, seem somewhat inevitable, or as some kind of manifestation of some peculiar German national character. But historians, fortunately, don't look at that earlier period like that anymore. And there's been, for decades, an explosion of research on the 19th century in Germany and the experience of World War I, and of course the Weimar Republic, looking at them on their own terms, rather than as just precursors to the Nazi period. So that's one thing. I think misperceptions. One of them that still persists, not so much among scholars, that comes to my mind is, and I referenced this before, the idea that Germany is somehow unique. And of course, every national context has its unique features. And I'm thinking about the 20th century experience. But it's one of the things I stress to my students when I teach about modern Germany and Nazi Germany, is that versions of what happened in Germany in the 30s and 40s have their unique features, but they could be replicated elsewhere. I mean, if you take the instance of genocide, I mean, there are multiple instances of genocide in just in the modern world, in the 19th century, through the 20th century, and into the 21st century. That's just one example. It could happen anywhere, is really the bottom line.
Your 2017 book, The Malmedy Massacre, the war crimes trial controversy, sifts through the distortions and fabrications from both the German and American sides that warped our understanding of the massacre. And you've got another book coming soon on the history of war crimes, law, politics, and armed conflict in the modern world. Did your experience researching and writing material for the 2017 book give you the skill set to write this next book?
Yeah, it was a good starting point. And the book War Crimes comes out next month with Routledge, and it's part of Routledge's seminar studies series, which goes back, I think, almost 50 years now. And these are short, accessible introductions to usually to big historical subjects and problems. They're for students, they're for other scholars, but they're also for journalists, for just interested readers who are looking for a concise, accessible introduction to a subject. People in the NGO and activist world, I hope, would find the titles in the series useful. So yeah, my book on the Malmedy Massacre and the trial and controversy that came after it definitely got me started on it. Though that book was very focused on war crimes trials conducted by the U.S. Army in occupied Germany right after the war. This is not a book about the big, much more famous Nuremberg trials. And it was a challenge. The seminar study series books are short, and they have to cover a lot of material. This is war crimes and war crimes law in the modern world, so from the 19th century to the present. So yeah, it was a good start, but one of the reasons I decided to do this was that I knew that I could learn a lot about a subject of very much of ongoing relevance and significance. And what I'll add to that is that I was looking for ways to give it a unique and up-to-date profile and not make it another book that I think put too much emphasis on Nuremberg. As important as it is, as groundbreaking as the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was. In a couple of ways, I tried to give the book a unique profile. One of them was to devote a chapter to colonial wars in the roughly the mid-19th century and extending well into the 20th century. Surveys or general books about, with a few exceptions, about war crimes and war crimes law don't tend to pay much attention to the problem of colonial wars. And this is in part reflects the fact that jurists and legal theorists and the people who built the architecture of modern international war crimes law generally haven't paid attention to it either. They certainly didn't at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And then at Nuremberg, the way that someone put it recently, that colonial wars just belong to a different moral universe. Well, I wanted to do something then to try to correct this. So I devoted a chapter to colonial wars in the book. And then in a few other ways, there's a chapter on women in war crimes, which is another subject that I think in surveys like this, it does not get the attention it deserves. And by women in war crimes, I mean not just women as victims, but also women as perpetrators. And there's been some new interesting scholarship on this. This is not a huge pool of people, but it is a historical reality and an important one that needs attention. And then finally, one more, and this was one of the more interesting chapters to write. I called it Future War, which may be a bit off the mark because it's already here. And that's a chapter that deals with some of the newer manifestations of modern warfare and the problems with international law adjusting to some of these newer realities. And I'm talking about private military companies. These are mercenaries. Now, mercenaries, of course, are nothing new in world history of warfare, but private military companies, PMCs, represent the corporatization of mercenaries. And if you've been following events in Ukraine recently with the Wagner Group, it's one of the more prominent examples. You'll know what I mean about how significant a phenomenon this is. Drones, for sure. Drones in international law were another part of this. The movement to incorporate ecocide and environmental warfare into the language and architecture of international law and the International Criminal Court, the ICC, would be another category. And then, of course, there's cyber war and efforts underway to grapple with cyber war as what's very much a reality as a form of warfare. And again, incorporate it into the language and practice of international law. So I tried to do all of those things to make the book as contemporary and relevant as I possibly could.
Kind of want to switch gears a little bit. Pretending that I am a student who's never taken your class, what can me, a prospective student, look forward to coming into one of your classes? Is there a single way you teach every class, or does it vary from subject to subject?
It varies for sure. And I've done a lot of experimenting in recent years. I've subjected both of you to some of my experimentation. and very happy to report that I'm a recipient this year of one of the Leonard and Claire Tao Teaching Awards for innovations in the classroom, and I'm really very proud of that distinction. And I am really interested in mainly in getting students to engage with the past in ways that go beyond the writing of traditional style research papers, which, look, I think the ability to write clearly, the ability to do research is extremely important. I'm not dismissing the importance of that, but I think that there are lots of different ways to engage with the past and communicate about it. So just a few years ago, I started experimenting with allowing students to develop their own projects, as long as it's related to the subject matter, to choose the format of their projects. Now, this has been great for me because I've gotten, and I hope it's been good for students, but I've gotten the most interesting results: photo essays, podcasts, screenplays, works of fiction, screencasts, works of art, paintings, 3D animation, drone photography. I've gotten all kinds of really, really interesting and creative work. And one of the reasons I did this goes to a second thing general thing about my classes. The data is clear. A history major, and more broadly a humanities major, is a marketable major. Students with backgrounds in the humanities and history go on to work in all kinds of fields and professions, not just teaching and education, but civil service, business, media, law, the sciences and medicine. It's a very, very long list. Now, that said, I take the position that we as your professors have a responsibility to help you develop possible career trajectories while you're here at Brooklyn College, which is one of the reasons, for example, I'm always encouraging students to make use of the Magner Career Center for internships and developing your CVs and networking. This is all very important. So my point then is, when I offer students the chance to develop projects and formats that they choose, I hope that they're thinking about not just their own personal, academic, intellectual interests, but also thinking practically, thinking about developing skill sets that they will be able to use as they develop their careers after graduating. That's become really important to me. So course to course, it varies. Now, the size of the course does influence the kinds of projects I assign. Teaching a course on the history of fascism, what is fascism for undergraduates, I divided them into small groups, and each group produced a podcast series. No formal writing projects, no exams, no midterm, no final. I wanted them to devote what time they had to devote to the course to speaking, to working with each other, and to talking, and to becoming acquainted with the podcast format.
In your classes and in your research, you have to cover very difficult subjects and sensitive material. And of course, other professors have to do the same, but you study the full range of human atrocities and cruelty. How do you personally handle the dark aspects of your field, and how do you maintain the sense of humanity among the statistics and seemingly endless amount of tragic stories that you encounter?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard. It's difficult. You have to remember the stories of people who demonstrated civil courage in ways large and small, ordinary people who demonstrated what George Orwell called common decency in very difficult and adverse circumstances. But it's very hard. I think, too, that you have to maintain an ability to appreciate the complexities of human behavior, and to understand that people do what they do out of a variety of motives. Nobody is entirely good or entirely bad. I'm reading right now Ian Baruma's new book, The Collaborators, which focuses on a handful of people in Europe and Asia during World War II who collaborated in various ways with Imperial Japan or with the Nazis. And this is one of his big points in this book is, well, look, we don't have to sympathize, but we need to develop the ability to empathize and understand. And that's another thing that I bring up a lot in my courses. But there's no question it can be really, really difficult to spend a lot of time engaging with this subject matter. But again, you've got to remember the stories of the people who resisted, and both large ways and small. For some years after World War II, when it came to resistance to the Nazis, I think most people, they thought about a very small number of people, and those were the officers who conspired to assassinate Hitler there were multiple conspiracies to assassinate Hitler. The one that came closest to succeeding in July 1944. This was very late, but a heroic effort nonetheless. Of course, a tragic and doomed one, but there were lots of other people who resisted too in ways that did not nearly become as famous. And fortunately, for a long time now, we've had a much more expanded recognition of what constitutes resistance. Of course, it's possible to define it too broadly to the point where it becomes meaningless. But we know now that resistance and civil courage came in a wide variety of forms, and this is something we can apply to areas of conflict and dictatorships all over the world.
You spent time in the Peace Corps and were stationed in the Philippines. In what ways did your experiences there shape you personally and professionally, as well as what do you have to say about the Peace Corps to students that are interested in joining it?
Yeah, I was in the Peace Corps in the early 90s, and the world was really different. I was stationed in a very remote part of Luzon Island, the northern part of Luzon Island in the Cagayan Valley, and it was it was really isolated, and there was no internet. I could occasionally make a phone call home, and I spent a lot of my time writing letters on paper. I mean, it was a tremendous experience. It's a beautiful and incredibly complex society, the Philippines, and I was engaged in making organic fertilizer. It was hard. It was really very, very difficult, very, very challenging. And, do I recommend it for people to consider? Sure. I more generally recommend some kind of volunteer work in whatever area. It doesn't have to be abroad. It certainly doesn't have to be the Peace Corps. Yeah, it was very difficult, but a very rewarding experience. I'd encourage any Brooklyn College student to look into it. That said, it's been a long time since I've talked to any volunteers. I don't know what the experience is like now with the internet and just and phones and being able to stay that connected. But my age, it was quite an experience to really live isolated. But last thing I'll say is that when I say isolated, look, I was living with a Filipino family. I had Filipino friends. So I don't want to say that I don't want to be misunderstood. I lived in a very welcoming and supportive environment. And yeah, it's challenging and a worthwhile experience for sure.
So we've got the war crimes book coming out next month. But other than that, is there current work that you're looking forward to, like new classes on the horizon or a next project, ongoing research, things like that?
Yeah, classes. I'll be teaching one in the fall because I'll be undertaking some administrative work at the college, but it will be a colloquium. So a 4-hour course, upper level course for history majors. And the joy of teaching these colloquia is they are set up to cover broad categories of political history, social history, which allows us as faculty to give them specific content and come up with titles, maybe something that we're just interested in writing about, or maybe have already written about. And based on a couple of classes I've been teaching recently and some of my own interests, I decided that this course would be about what happened to all the Nazis after World War II. Since I'm teaching a course on what is fascism this semester, I got into that subject a little bit and was talking to David Mounier, a history major and member of the BC Historical Society. And he was asking me, well, what's the colloquium going to be about? And I hadn't decided yet. And we were talking and I just sort of came out. It had been brewing somewhere in the back of my head. And I noticed when I brought up the idea, his eyes kind of widened, and I sensed that it was interested in. So look, the class is just as it says, what happened to all the Nazis? There were millions of members of the Nazi party, but there were also, of course, millions of Germans who were compromised in some way with National Socialism, or supported National Socialism in some way and weren't in the party. What happened to all of them after the war? And this is in part, of course, about the reconstruction of Germany. In particular, how was it after the experience of the Third Reich and the war, did West Germany become a stable prosperous liberal democracy. This is a country with not only no happy experience with it, it's a country that experienced Nazi rule and the Second World War and an occupation. Communist East Germany is also part of this question too, because there were plenty of ex-Nazis in Communist East Germany also. And there's the phenomenon of former Nazis, many of them guilty of heinous crimes, who changed their identities and left Germany and went to Egypt or Syria or Argentina or Paraguay. Relatively, though, there are not that many of them. If you wanted to find a war criminal, ex-Nazi war criminal after 1945, the place you were most likely to find one was Germany. So more broadly, I'm interested in Reconstruction and what happens after a period of dictatorship with all of the people who made that dictatorship work. Well, not all of the people, but millions of them, even if it's the top leadership is gone, as was the case in Germany. So our focus will be Germany, but there will be a comparative dimension too. And there are other cases I want to look at, like post-conflict Rwanda is a really interesting one, for example, or Spain, after the death of Francisco Franco in the mid-70s and Spain's transition to democracy. So that'll be a colloquium, relatively smaller class, lots of discussion, and I'm really, really looking forward to that. In terms of my own work, I don't know what I want to do next. I'll just be honest with you. I have some ideas brewing, floating around in my mind. One of my interests, and this goes back to the question you asked me earlier about what gets overshadowed in the historiography of modern Germany. I think one area that needs a lot more attention is history of the post-World War II German far right. It is getting more attention by German and American scholars. Esther Adair, who is a recent PhD from the CUNY Graduate Center, is going to be publishing a book with Bloomsbury, what I think is going to be a very important book on the far right in Germany after 1989, after the revolution and reunification of Germany. But if you wanted to find a good, accessible, one-volume English language history of the far right in Germany since 1945, it doesn't exist. One that goes from 45 up to the present, to the Alternative for Germany and the very complex far right scene in that country. It's not there. Somebody needs to write that book. I don't know if it'll be me, but somebody needs to do that. I'm interested in the late occupation period in the 1950s, when both the Americans and the British as occupiers and the newly emerging democratic West German government, how they responded to the far right, which was still a presence in Germany, and it was evolving. Yes, the Nazi Party was gone, of course, banned, but there were still far-right parties and organizations and subversive activities. And there's been a lot of material declassified by the CIA and by the German government in recent years that really needs to be looked at for this period, the 1950s, really formative period for West Germany and West German democracy. And I've got some other ideas too. I could keep rattling these off, but it's a nice position to be in with a book coming out, and I don't have a book contract right now. I need some time to kind of breathe and think about what I want to jump into next. You commit yourself to a book project, and it's a big commitment. You dive into something, you want to make sure that it's something you really want to spend most likely a couple of years working with. It's got to mean something to you. So. Yeah. I'm going to take a little time to give that some thought.
Yeah, I mean, you had the encyclopedia, and then you have the war crimes book. So I say just enjoy the accomplishment for a second.
Yeah, thank you. If I could just say something about the encyclopedia, this was, to my knowledge, the first English language biographical encyclopedia of Adolf Hitler, which came out a year or two ago with Rowman and Littlefield, a part of a biographical encyclopedia series that press is doing. I was lucky. I agreed to do that right before the pandemic hit. I really feel for students and my colleagues who were planning to write archive-based dissertations and books right when the pandemic hit, because all of a sudden you couldn't go to libraries and archives. And fortunately we're out of that now, but it really dampened and delayed a lot of people's careers. It did force us to become more creative in how we do our research, which I suppose is one bright spot. But I was lucky because I signed a contract to do a book that did not require me going to any archives. It wasn't planned. It was I just got lucky. And it was a challenging assignment to write that encyclopedia. But one of the the great things about it was it allowed me to catch up on a lot of scholarship, recent scholarship, in this case on Adolf Hitler's life. And like the War Crimes book, I learned a lot. And enjoyed writing it, and hope that people will find it valuable.
Well, we're nearing the end here. We have our final Fast Five questions just to get a sense of you as a person and not a professor. Just very quick, no thinky questions. Just whatever first pops into your head. Do you have a favorite book?
Oh,
That's the usual response. Yeah.
Yeah.
when I've been asked that question before, and since you want to make this quick, I'll make it quick. One of the first books that comes to my mind is Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and for just a number of reasons, I have great admiration for Thompson. As complicated and conflicted a character as he was, but great admiration for him as a writer. As a thinker, as an observer of American culture, and it's just a wicked good time, that book, and one that I always enjoy revisiting.
What is your favorite food?
If I can name a region, it would be the entire Mediterranean region, but that's one I always gravitate to. I love to cook, so when I do, it's generally in this area. Now, that said, some years ago I was lucky enough to be able to spend some time traveling around Vietnam, and food-wise, since I'm always thinking with my head, and I think about food wherever it is I travel, and that was one of the greatest food experiences of my life, which I had expected, but it was even better than I expected.
Favorite non-work activity?
That's easy. I ride a motorcycle. It's been a passion of mine for some years now, and that's it. That's what it is. I figured I've been across the entire length of the country now twice. I think of the trips that I've taken, and it's most definitely a way to, among other things, to get my face away from a computer, my head out of books, and really, really do something very dramatically different. Most of the time I ride alone. If the weather holds up, I'll ride with a group of people in New Jersey. I do that sometimes. Tomorrow, yeah, it's great fun and a really good diversion.
That might be the coolest answer to that question we've had so far on the podcast.
Yeah.
Your favorite thing to do in New York City?
I think it would be the times either alone or with my girlfriend. I like to just engage with the city's cultural institutions. I love to wander through museums, and I don't do that enough. And adjacent to that is I love film. I love cinema. If you look at this stretch of area on and off Houston Street in Manhattan, you have, well, the Sunshine is long gone, but there's the Angelica, the Metrograph, all in this vicinity, the IFC, and of course the Film Forum. And I think I'm leaving out one. If you love cinema, I don't know if there's any place else in the world that has this kind of concentration in that area and in other parts of the city of just wonderful independent cinemas doing festivals and then very often bringing people in to give a talk. One of my favorite experiences was at the Metrograph shortly before the pandemic. They were screening Deliverance, and Burt Reynolds was there. I didn't know that he was dying, and I mean, he looked fantastic. This beautiful blue or purple suit on, and he had this cane with this gorgeous ornate handle on the top of it. But he was reminiscing and taking questions from the audience, which can often be kind of painful kinds of questions, but he was a very good, very, very good sport about it. I got to ask him a question. I mean, it was that kind of experience I just associate so closely with living in New York. It's just another night out in New York. And I would just add to that one more thing, and that's small venue live music, which is another thing I don't take much of advantage of as I would like to. Saw recently in Manhattan, a fantastic Belarusian band, Molchat Doma. That was a great show just a few weeks ago. And, as expensive as New York is, it's still possible to hear great music in smaller venues for not that much money. Everybody wants to play in New York. Everybody wants to play in Williamsburg and Greenpoint. So, film, museums, live music.
Favorite music genre?
Oh, I'll put in a plug here for one of the musicians that I admire most is Iggy Pop. For now, I think going on 9 years, Iggy has had a weekly Sunday radio show on BBC Six, and he plays everything. I mean, I don't know where else you can hear speed metal and Frank Sinatra and country music and hip hop all in one show. So the playlists are all available, the BBC6 app and BBC6 website, and I recommend the show to everybody. I always look forward to it on Sundays. So it's not a direct answer to your question and not a very fast one, but Carter, I'll just say this. As I get older, I really try to keep an open mind. I like what I like. Goth and electronica and the records on the 4AD label going back to the 1980s, had a profound influence on me, as did David Bowie and Iggy Pop and Lou Reed and the Velvets as a kind of triumvirate. But as I get older, I want to keep an open mind.
Your bookshelf behind you kind of gave that answer away before you even said anything. I see the Iggy Pop book right there.
Yeah, that's a collection of lyrics to most of his music, and well, it makes for interesting and diverting reading for sure.
Before we go, one final question. You're in a desert walking along in the sand when all of a sudden you look down and see a tortoise. It's crawling toward you. You reach down and flip the tortoise over on its back. The tortoise lays on its back, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it can't. Not without your help, but you're not helping. Why is that, Professor Remy?
It's
okay. We're pretty sure you're not a replicant. It's okay. That's fine.
I'm not a replicant.
We're 99% sure.
99% sure that I'm not a replicant. I don't know if you want to look into this is a podcast. You can't really.
Oh,
we are doing this on Zoom. You can maybe take a close look at my eyeball.
Just like up and to the left.
Yeah.
Up and to the left. Yeah. You didn't ask me what. You asked me what my favorite book was, but if there was a question on my favorite film, Blade Runner would rank up there pretty high.
It's fantastic.
And we could do a whole nother episode on which version of Blade Runner. That's a whole other discussion debate, but I'll just say Blade Runner. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Professor Remy, for doing this. This was a blast, really.
A pleasure.
Been really fun. I'm so glad you guys are doing this series, and I know how busy you are and how hard you work, and really look forward to listening to the other ones.
Our Professor podcast was recorded with the permission of the Brooklyn College History Department and our student interviewees. We would like to thank both the students and faculty for their contributions.